We're on verse 26 of chapter 1. It says, "Then they gave lots to them, and the lot fell to Matthias, and he was counted one with the 11 apostles." We do not really know how the lots worked. We have found some of the lots, but the high priest used to wear a square thing that had 12 stones on it, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. And the names of the tribes were carved on the stones. And it'll tell you in the Bible what the stones were even. But it was actually a purse. And inside the purse, there were 2 sticks. And the sticks were flat, and they were dark on one side and light on the other. And these sticks would be thrown on the ground, and we don't know how they were used. It could be if both sides were up, it meant one thing. If one side was up and one down, it meant something else. It could also mean that if they touched, they meant one thing, and if they were separate, they meant something else. But we do know they could always be used to choose between 2 things, a yes and no answer, and so that's the way they relied on God to speak to them. One of the things to know about God is that there's 1,000 ways that God can speak to people. And we actually choose how we decide to listen to God. And some people listen to God through the scriptures. Some people listen to God through prayer. Some people listen to God through music. But you actually choose how you listen to God, and God will respond to that. I'm very interested in the scriptures. I love the scriptures, and I teach the scriptures. But there have been great saints in the church who've never read the Bible at all. And God spoke to them in other ways. The fact is, God will speak to you, and you get to choose how it's going to happen. And so whatever track you take, and so this was one of the ones I did. It sounds kind of strange to us. It sounds like voodoo or something. But God spoke to them in this way because that's the way they chose to do it. Okay? So Matthias now is replacing Judas. And I think I told you that the reason why they replaced him is because of the importance of the number 12. You had to have 12 apostles. If you read the scriptures carefully, we only know about 3 of the apostles. All the stories concern Peter, James, and John. There's very little about any of the other apostles, but it's important that we have the number 12. So they name, all 12 of them. Now, when the time for Pentecost was fulfilled, they were all in one place together. Of course, they were scared to death. They were still in that room. Okay? So they're hiding in that room. I'd like you to know that Pentecost is a Jewish feast, not a Christian feast. And the word Pentecost means 50 days. And it's 50 days after Passover. It's the only Jewish feast we've retained. Okay? And we retain it because it's the day on which the Holy Spirit came. But it is a Jewish feast. You asked earlier about, why Jesus was around for 40 days and everything. It could be specifically that Jesus wanted the coming of the Holy Spirit to be on Pentecost. And because of the reason is, I think you know that a Jew, depending on how close you live to Jerusalem, if you live fairly close to Jerusalem, you're required to be in Jerusalem for Passover. Now, if you lived in Nazareth where Jesus was, you were required to come to Jerusalem maybe once every 2 or 3 years for Passover. If you live in the United States, as a Jew, you're supposed to go to Jerusalem once in your life for Passover. And if you go very seldom, like once in your life, you're expected to stay from Passover until Pentecost, the 50 days, so that you can celebrate the thing. So anyway, there's now the 50 days, and people who came from a distance are still in Jerusalem, and they're waiting for this big feast of Pentecost. And so we have the coming of the Holy Spirit. Suddenly, there came from the sky a noise like a strong driving wind, and it filled the entire house in which they were. I'd like you to notice a word here, and incidentally, someone mentioned earlier about the book of Revelation. It is the word that appears most frequently in the book of Revelation, and it is the word like. You see, when the person sees, when John has the visions from the book of Revelation, they're so unusual that he can only tell you what they're like. He can't tell you what they are. And the temptation is, when I tell you something is like something, to think it is the thing. And they always speak of a wind blowing through the house. It doesn't say a wind blew through the house. They said it sounded like a wind. Okay? So it has the sound of a wind. Then there appeared to them tongues as of fire, which parted and came to rest on each one of them. Okay? Now the tongues of fire come. I don't know how many of you have ever studied much about the Roman Catholic service, but an example of what this is found in the Easter Vigil, where everyone carries a candle. And if you listen very carefully to that prayer they sing, which is called the Exultet, you'll find out what's going on with that. One of the really curious things is if I were to put a candle here with a fire on it, and every one of you were to come up and light your candles, do you know, no matter how many candles were lit, there would never be less fire up here. The fire would always be the same, no matter how many of your candles were lit. And no matter how many candles you light off your candle will still be the same. And what they want to show is the Spirit divides, but the Spirit is never diminished. So when you receive the power of the Holy Spirit, it is as though you are the only person in the universe and receive the fullness of the Spirit. Now, if that Spirit goes to 20 million people, you have not received less. 20 million people have been totally filled with the Spirit. And this Spirit moves through history and moves through the community, endlessly dividing, endlessly separating, endlessly multiplying, and never diminished in any person, any individual, any experience. No one experiences less of the Spirit than another person. The Spirit comes in fullness. And you and I decide how much we're going to use, okay? It's sort of like, the electricity that comes into your house. You don't get any less electricity than someone else does. But there's some people who have their lights on and have their heater on and have, all these gadgets plugged in. One of the things that's amazing to me, I never realize how much stuff I have plugged in the house until the electricity goes off. I don't know why everything electric has to have a clock on it, but they do. And as soon as the electricity goes off, all the clocks are wrong. And you have to go around the house setting clocks, okay? You go through the whole house setting clocks. Well, anyway, the Holy Spirit is like that. You can decide how much of the Spirit you want to use, but you will never exhaust the Spirit. There's just this massive amount of Spirit available to everyone. And so the Spirit comes, and He comes in these tongues of fire so that they see this, they see this fire that divides and is never diminished. They were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in different tongues as the Spirit enabled them to proclaim. Understand there are several gifts of tongues. Here they began to speak in different tongues as the Spirit prompted them. This is a prayer. When you and I all pray in tongues, and we're all speaking different languages at the same time, the fact of the matter is that is a prayer, and we call it a prayer tongue. It is a prayer tongue that's given to you to pray to God. There is no interpretation of it, because it's just between you and God. So it is a prayer thing. And I'll tell you, when I used to have organize the prayer meetings, we used to have a rule in the prayer meeting. You could never have more than 1/4 of the people new. There had to be 3/4 of people there who were used to the Spirit, because people who first come to a prayer meeting are so surprised by tongues that they listen and watch. And to the degree they're listening and watching, it becomes more and more embarrassing to speak in tongues. And so the gift of tongues can be harmed by having a lot of people around who aren't speaking in tongues. Okay? So when someone prays in tongues, if you don't have a tongue, you should pray in English. But the idea is when people are praying in tongues, pray. Don't listen or pay attention to other people's tongues. Okay? So this is, now they're all praying in this way. Now there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven staying in Jerusalem. The Jewish religion over a period of history has gone through probably the most serious diaspora of any religion in the world. Anytime there was a real serious conflict, Jews would go to different areas. And recently, one of the great wonders of DNA is DNA, they're able now to establish who actually is Jewish. And I don't know if you know this, but a few years ago, there used to be a group of people in Ethiopia who claimed they were Jewish. They claimed they were descended from the Queen of Sheba when she went to visit Solomon, and they had a child, and they descended from that child, so they were Jewish people. Everyone thought they were crazy, okay? And they're black and all this sort of thing. They examined their DNA, they're Jewish. And so when they had the famine in Ethiopia, Israel brought them all to Israel. Just picked them all up and brought them to Israel. Under Jewish law, if you're of Jewish blood, you have the right to immigrate to Israel at any time. And so they brought them into the country. Now, to understand, Jews then are in every country in the world, and that was true even in the days of Jesus. Pockets of Jews were in every country in the world, okay? At this sound, they gathered in a large crowd, but they were confused because each one heard them speaking in their own language. Now, when they hear this sound, and remember it's a sound like a wind, so this sound wasn't just heard by the people inside, but was heard by everyone. I don't know if you've ever studied much about miracles, but one of the interesting things about miracles is sometimes a miracle is only available to a particular person. Like for instance, you know, when Bernadette was having the apparitions at Lourdes, there were times when there were thousands of people there with her, but only she saw the Virgin Mary. Same thing at Fatima. There were a lot of people who accompanied the children to Fatima, but they did not see the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary was seen by those children. Well, in this particular instance, everyone in town heard the noise. Okay? So again, when working miracles, God can do whatever he wants. Nobody tells God what to do. So God does it any way he wants. And so we have this thing occur where everyone heard them. And then everyone heard them in their own language. Now you understand this is a different kind of tongue. This isn't a prayer tongue. This is a teaching tongue. And the teaching tongue, the apostles went out on the balcony, and most particularly Peter, but you get the impression they all went out, and they were all speaking their own language, which would be Aramaic. Aramaic was the language they spoke. So they went out on the balcony, they spoke in Aramaic, but everyone heard them in their native language. Okay? It says, they were astounded, and in amazement they asked, are these people who are speaking Galileans? Okay? How did they know they were Galileans? Can anyone guess? Their accent. Okay? Do you remember when Peter was in during the trial of the high priest? And the woman said, I saw you with him. And he denied it. And she said, even your accent gives you away. You're a Galilean, you know? Even your accent gives you away. The Galileans had a very distinctive accent. And isn't it interesting, when they spoke in tongues through the power of the Spirit, they still had an accent in the different languages they spoke. I find that very curious, okay? So anyway, the speaking, they can tell by the accent that these people are all from Galilee. He says, then how does each of us hear them in his own native language? Okay? So they're very curious as to how each person hears in their native language. And to be honest, this may not be what we would call an auricular miracle. An auricular miracle is a miracle in the ear. It could be a miracle in the mind. Not that they heard them, but they understood them in their own language. You know, there's a real difference. I'll give you an example. When I was in Canada, I think you know that I was in the French part of Canada, and the general language is French. And in the house I lived, everyone spoke French. And we had people there in the religious order I was in, from many different areas. But one of the areas we had people there from was from Spain, okay? And one of the interesting things about the Spanish, French and Spanish are close enough together that the Spanish never had to learn French. They basically understood it. They couldn't translate it, but they understood it. The French never had to learn Spanish because they basically understood it, even though they couldn't speak it. And it was very interesting. You'd watch a Frenchman and a Spaniard carry on this conversation, each speaking a separate language, and they seemed to know exactly what was going on, you know. It was always amazing to me. I had no idea what either of them were saying. So then they go on to list. They say we are Parthians, Medes, Elamites, inhabitants of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia. Cappadocia, incidentally, is Turkey. Pontus and Asia. Asia is also Turkey for them. They didn't know the Far East as we know it, okay? Persia, Pamphylia, Egypt, and the districts of Libya near Cyrene, as well as travelers from Rome. Both Jews, converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs, yet we hear them speaking in our own tongues of the mighty acts of God. Okay? So they're showing how wide these are. And incidentally, they named these different ones because each spoke a different language. Many of these areas are right beside one another, but they each spoke a different language. And in the speaking of the different language, they all understand. But what are they doing? They are speaking of the mighty acts of God. The interesting thing is, when you and I read this, they're not only speaking of the mighty acts of God, they're doing one of the mighty acts of God. This idea of everyone hearing in different languages. One of the things that I think is very curious about being a human being is that you and I can oftentimes see something happen and see something insignificant about it that seems so important to us. And simultaneously, something much more important can really be happening. And I'll give you an example of the reverse thing. You know, when you go to a doctor, the reason you go to a doctor is because of a symptom. No one goes to a doctor because of a sickness. You go because of a symptom. And you go to the doctor and you say, you know, I'll give you an example. You go to the doctor and you say, my left leg seems kind of numb. Well, you know, if your left leg seems kind of numb, there can be something wrong with your leg or your hip or your back or your brain. That's all that is a symptom. You don't know where it is, okay? Well, a lot of the wonders that you and I see of God working in the world are only symptoms. They're symptoms of the mighty things that He's doing. But the mighty things that He's doing are so far beyond us, you and I can't comprehend them. So what we are watching, what you and I call miracles, are symptoms of the glory of God. They are not His glory. They are the symptoms of the glory of God. The glory of God is way beyond our apprehending it. Okay? So they were all astounded and bewildered and said to one another, "What does this mean?" But others were scoffing. They've had too much wine. Okay? And it says too much new wine. They believed that new wine was made you crazy. The fact is, it's much easier to get drunk on new wine. And one of the reasons is new wine has such a low alcoholic content, you don't realize you're drinking wine. I was in Germany one time, and one of the interesting laws, you know, the guy who built the castle that Sleeping Beauty's castle is modeled after was called Ludwig the Mad, and he built this magnificent castle. And anyway, one of the laws that Ludwig passed, bless his little heart, was the law that if you sell alcohol on the vineyard, on the grounds of the vineyard where it's produced, there is no tax on it. Now, I don't know if you know this, but on a bottle of wine, 4/5 of the cost is taxes. And that's because you pay a separate tax on vineyard land than you do on regular land. Then you pay a tax on grapes. Then you pay a tax on the juice that's taken from the grapes. Then you pay a tax on the wine, a tax on the bottle, and then you get taxed when you go to the store. 4/5 of the price. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Mexico and bought alcohol in a store. You know, you buy a bottle of tequila for I don't know what here. You go to Mexico, you get a gallon of tequila for 50 cents. That's what it costs to produce it, you know? The rest of it is all taxes. So anyway, stuff is very, very cheap. But in order to have it cheap that way in Germany, you have to have the wine that's produced right at that vineyard, which means it's more alcoholic later in the year and less alcoholic earlier in the year, because they take it right out of the vats where it's aging. Then once it's bottled and gone, you don't get it. You get the next year's thing. But I was there one time. It was really funny. We would go around, and when we arrived in Germany, I would say it tasted flat out like grape juice. You know, good grape juice, but grape juice, you know. By the time we left, it was wine, you know. It was really wine. But you went around from place to place and just, you know, kind of the way it was done. So the danger with new wine is that you drink too much of it because it's like grape juice. And when you think about it, all these people understood the apostles in their own language. How could someone not see that as a miracle? How could someone begin to scoff at that? And you have to understand that one of the things about being a human being, you and I go into things with a certain optic. Like if you were to take Jesus, when Jesus came among the people, there are a group of people, the Pharisees, who were threatened as teachers because Jesus came in and he never had a teacher. And you can't have someone teaching who's never had a teacher. You can't have someone brilliant who's never had a teacher. So they were against anything he said long before he said it. The priests were really against Jesus because he was so popular. He was taking people away from them. And it didn't matter what he was saying or how he was speaking. And you know, you and I have got to be able to learn to listen to someone and to hear whether God's speaking through them before we judge it from our own optic. Politically, in the United States, we're being torn apart as a country that way. Liberal people will not listen to any conservative no matter what they say. And conservative people will not listen to any liberal no matter what they say. And each side seems convinced the other side's demonic. Okay? That tears a country apart. The fact of the matter is, you need to be able to listen to opposing opinions and decide whether or not they're good. Because you listen to it doesn't mean you believe it. But you have to be able to listen to it to decide whether you will accept it or not. And that's very important in religion. There are many people who speak very differently than you and I do in the church. And ultimately the church moves that way. You know, that those of us who knew the church before and after Vatican II know it's a very, very different church. But the whole church was changed by that council. The church is changing right now, radically changing because of the new Pope and the way he's going about things and his attitude to poverty. It is changing the church. And you know, the fact of the matter is, the church is a living entity. The church is the bride of Jesus Christ. And so this church grows and develops. And any one of us who isn't open to growing and developing will be left behind. We need to grow and develop as the church goes, and we listen to the things. And things you accept, good. Things you reject, fine. But listen to them. It isn't that you have to take everything. But we need to be a people who listen to one another. I'll tell you, when I was first ordained, I made it a resolution in my life that I would never try and convert anyone. That my entire life I would always try for mutual comprehensibility. That when I talked to a person, I wanted them to understand what I was saying, and I wanted to understand what they were saying. I believe that if I understand what you're saying, and you understand what I'm saying, we'll both agree on the truth. Because I think truth has power. But don't seek to convert. Just seek to come to the truth. Because I'll tell you a secret that you all know. The truth is Jesus. So if you get people to the truth, you've got them. Okay? You don't need to convert them. Let Jesus do that. That's his job. Okay? The next thing is, we go now, having had this crowd, Peter goes out to speak to them. You know, it's very strong in religious people. When you gather a crowd, you always do something. In Peter's day, when you got a crowd together, you preached. In our day, you get a crowd together, you take a collection. But anyway, the idea is once you get the crowd gathered, as a religious leader, there's something you're supposed to do. So Peter stood up with the 11, raised his voice, and proclaimed to them, "You who are Jews, indeed all of you staying in Jerusalem, let this be known to you. Listen to my words. These people are not drunk as you suppose, for it's only 9 o'clock in the morning." I am presuming that Peter, unlike most of us, has never seen anyone drunk at 9 o'clock in the morning. But anyway, he says, "No, this is what was spoken through the prophet Joel. It will come to pass in the last day, God says, that I will pour out a portion of my Spirit upon all flesh. Your sons and daughters shall prophesy. Your young men shall see visions. Your old men dream dreams." I'd like to look for a moment at that. Young men see visions, old men dream dreams. I'd like you to notice, to me personally, that's the difference between being young and old. A young person sees visions, they see things to do. An old person thinks about things without any thought that it might be done. So like, for instance, a young person will think about the house they would really like to live in. And they would like to one day make enough money to build that house. That's what they really are doing. An old person will think about a house that they would like to live in and daydream about it. But there's no thought of moving to it. The way to preserve youth is always envision and never daydream. Look forward to what you're doing, not just daydream. You have all of eternity to daydream. Okay? You can look forward to what you're doing. That is what creates youth. It's one of the really important things to remember. You must have a goal beyond you, or you can't do that. If your goal is for your life, your goal will diminish as your life goes on, because your ability to do those things sort of diminishes. But you know, if you have a goal beyond yourself, let's say you have a goal for the United States as a country, that's going to continue beyond you. And you can work towards that goal even as you're dying, because that goal will be carried on long after your death. If you envision a goal for the church, if you envision a goal for your family through children or grandchildren, there are 1,000 ways to envision a goal that is beyond you. But make sure you have a goal beyond your life. Because if you don't have a goal beyond your life, your youth will diminish with age. Okay? And I've mentioned to somebody, I probably have told you this before, but you know, I come from a family that lives a very long time, and simultaneously it's a family in which people tend to remain rather young. And I don't know if I've told you this before, but like my grandmother died at 106. It's always interesting when I go into a doctor, because they ask you, when did your father die? And I look at him and I say, my father's not dead, you know? And they, you know, well, when did your grandmother die? About a week ago, actually, you know? But the fact of the matter is, my grandmother died at 106.